I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's the President's Guy, and today we're going to be doing a reaction to a fairly old Mr. Beat video. This one being his 10 worst American presidents. For full disclosure, I have seen this list before. I actually recorded this video about a month ago, but I had actually screwed up and some of my audio settings to where I wasn't recording the desktop audio and it was just recording through my microphone, so it was just echoing a bunch. You probably heard it in my Dr. Mike reaction, and sorry about that. So hopefully that situation has been rectified. So I have seen this video, although I've kind of already forgotten some of the entries on it. And there are a few notable exceptions that I think should be on this list that aren't, and we'll get into that later. So let's see what Mr. Beat thinks are the 10 worst American presidents.
What is up? I am Mr. Beat, and President's Day is over, so no longer are we going to be praising past presidents, but we are going to be talking trash about past presidents.
Somebody send Obama some life hacks on how to be a good president. Ha ha. Like I bet that would help. LOL.
Here is my vid.
You know, it is interesting to look back. You know, that clip would have been from about 2015, 2016, to see a president that could poke fun at themselves like that. And you got to give Obama credit for you know, even doing that in the first place, and you know, just having a good sense of humor.
Video counting down the
10 worst presidents in American history.
According to my opinion, this is just my opinion, I'm a little biased, we all are, so keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
I'm also aware that this may reveal some of my political beliefs, and that's fine. But without further ado, let's just...
I wonder if he's going to redo this list. I think he's mentioned it at some point, somewhat recently, and considering, you know, just how different the political strata is these days compared to when this came out, you know, 7, 8, 9 years ago. Be interesting to see what opinions of his have changed.
Jump right into it, as Philip DeFranco says. Number 10, Benjamin Harrison. Okay, he was all about really high tariffs, and you all know how I feel about tariffs, right? Right, I'm not a very big fan of tariffs. Bad job, Benjamin. Harrison...
It's weird to judge a president for being against tariffs in the late 19th century when, you know, still relatively post-Civil War. That's the way the government made most of its money. And protectionism was a lot more important back then, considering America didn't make a bunch of stuff that... Let me rephrase. Most of the things that we made, we consumed. Most of the things we consumed, we made. So when you have a new country like America, at this point we're only a little over 100 years old, we have to allow businesses to establish themselves here before we open up markets for competition. Competition is good because it can drive prices down. But in order to have America thriving in a particular business, you want it to be established first. So I don't fault Harrison for that. He's certainly not in my bottom 10. Now, tariffs in a more modern sense, particularly the way Trump is handling them, are a little different and can be damaging. And it's, again, it's apples and oranges because it's a global economy now. And this is over 130 years ago. So I think it's an interesting and odd way to make someone on your bottom president's list.
Was supportive of the overthrow of Queen Leokwilani and the taking of Hawaii, which is one of the shadiest parts of American history. Also, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred under his watch, okay? Not only did Harrison approve, but the Army gave out Medals of Honor like they were candy afterward for a massacre.
Now that's true. Now I will say, I'm fairly certain that Dwight Eisenhower's in his top presidents list in terms of best. And he oversaw a lot of overthrowing of leaders in other countries. So, not that I agree with Harrison doing it, but I just think it's a little inconsistent. And sure, the Wounded Knee Massacre happens under his watch, but you have to be careful. You can't blame a president, and you can't give them credit for everything that happens just because they're in the office. That doesn't mean he's not responsible. But the Army also is independent of the executive in terms of handing out Medals of Honor. Now, if Harrison had handed out a bunch of Medals of Freedom to these people, that'd be different. But he had no direct say in that. And that's not to say that he didn't approve of it, but I don't think Harrison's in my bottom 10.
Number 9, Andrew Johnson.
No, he's in the bottom
going to put him on this
2.
list. I feel like a lot of historians talk a lot of trash about him unfairly, but, you know, I'm all about character, right? And this guy was driven by his ego. This guy cared first and foremost only about his own legacy and his own desires. He refused to compromise, and he seemed to dig in his heels when he faced opposition. Speaking of opposition, just as blatant opposition to civil rights for African Americans, as seen with his fighting the 14th and 15th Amendments and Civil Rights Act. I mean, that ended up holding back African Americans for generations. This makes him look exceptionally bad, and he was a white supremacist. But mostly, though, his stubbornness in politics. I mean, I know the radical Republicans that he opposed were also stubborn, but his refusal to compromise with them just made it look like he only cared about his own selfish desires and didn't care about the greater good of the country.
So Andrew Johnson is perhaps the worst president of all time if we eliminate modern politics, because you can directly relate every single bit of African American disparity back to that man. And if not for Congress and congressional Reconstruction trying to pick up the pieces where presidential Reconstruction left off, who's to say how far African Americans could have actually made progress if you had a president behind them and we didn't have to wait 4 years for Grant to get into office to get that? He vetoed every single piece of legislation designed to help the freedmen. He tried to get rid of the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed the Civil Rights Acts. I mean, he just did everything he could to get in the way. And while he was not in favor of the slave aristocracy, he was only against them because he supported the poor white yeoman farmers. By far, the worst decision that Abraham Lincoln ever made was putting Andrew Johnson on his ticket. An absolute horrendous president from top to bottom. Didn't do a good thing other than, keeping Lincoln's cabinet intact as long as he did and not firing Grant is the best thing I can say. Horrible, horrible president. No redeeming qualities about this man whatsoever, and he looks like Tommy Lee Jones.
Number 8, George W. Bush. Okay, obviously I'm even more biased living through the presidency of George W. Bush, but I disagreed with his response to the 9/11 attacks in several ways. The AUMF, or the Authorization to Use Military Force Against Terrorists, basically give a blank check for the president to fight terrorism around the world. It's still in effect. The Patriot Act, which really was one of the worst laws ever passed in American history, really just stripped many civil liberties that Americans used to take for granted. The Iraq War, dragging out the Afghanistan War with no end in sight. Not a fan of all these things. His response to Hurricane Katrina. The Great Recession happened under his watch, and he responded to it with crony capitalism, which I'm not a big fan of, bailing out banks and corporations,
Obama did that too.
No Child Left Behind. No teacher I know actually is a fan of No Child Left Behind. Not a good law. He expanded.
Also, the Postal Accountability and Reform Act is what destroyed the post office for 15 years until Biden passed, I forget the name of it, but he passed in 2021 or 2022, a law basically to fix the post office because the Accountability and Reform Act basically forced them to operate at a deficit. It's another one of those things that fiscal conservatives like to do, where they're penny wise and dollar foolish, where they want to nickel and dime in certain places, but it only ends up costing more money in others because you take away the infrastructure and the apparatus that an agency needs to succeed. So that's not good. George W. Bush is a good man, and I genuinely believe that. But I think he allowed himself to take a back seat too much to other people. Obviously people are going to think about Dick Cheney first and foremost. But the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War all started, on faulty premises and dubious intelligence, to say the least. And W was pretty ineffective in his second term, too. He had 90% approval after 9/11. He was down in the 30s or 20s when he leaves. So it just shows how steeply he fell off. But a good man, I genuinely believe. But yeah, he's probably a bottom 10 president.
Expanded the surveillance state. The Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, all that, detaining suspects without warrants who were never charged with any crime, never given any due process, just showed that he often made decisions out of fear, not out of reason. But such a nice guy, though. I love you, W. Sorry about this, if you're watching. Number 7, Woodrow Wilson. First of all, Cypher from The Cynical Historian has definitely influenced my perception of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson!
Weird
so
man.
a shout out to him. Go watch his 2 videos where he just completely bashes him.
Good
Wilson
videos,
was all
though.
about spreading democracy around the world, a very egocentric foreign policy. Sure, it said, hey, self-determination, right? But it assumed that Americans knew what was best for the entire world, and thus, Wilson paved the way for future American interventionism. One big reason why he got elected in 1916 was because he said he kept the country out of World War I. What happens after he gets reelected? He gets the country involved in World War I.
Almost immediately.
Congress to declare war, and they do. And during the war, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, 2 of the worst laws in American history.
The Alien Enemies
on
Act.
the First Amendment. And Cypher pointed this out in one of his videos. I never knew this, but apparently he wanted the Sedition Act before the United States even entered World War I. And most of our presidents were racist, okay? We've got to consider historical relativism, but Wilson was exceptionally racist even for his time.
He was, and he was also someone who, when he was the governor of New Jersey, he signed a bill for compulsory sterilization for people with Down syndrome. He chained a black man literally to his desk and had a cage built around him. He resegregated the government, where Grant had desegregated it. As a human being, perhaps the worst president we've ever had. Just a horrendous human being. And he's going to talk about, airing Birth of a Nation at the White House. And he is what you would call an unreconstructed Southerner. He's from the Deep South. He ends up living in New Jersey, where he's the governor before he becomes president. But one of his earliest memories is seeing Jefferson Davis running away from the Union cavalry. So, very much a pro-Southern president, and just abysmal. And I've said this before a lot in videos where Wilson comes up, but the left hate him for being racist and the right hate him for being a progressive in terms of expanding the federal government. So there's no one left for him to like, and he has just been plummeting down the presidential tier rankings from historians. So I think that's going to continue to happen, and it's a good thing, because he was just an egotistical man, where if you didn't go with his idea, you were just a dummy. And if you didn't listen to him, he always knew what was the right thing to do. So much so that the League of Nations becomes a thing and we don't even get in it. So, just goes to show you.
The screening of the Birth of a Nation at the White House and then calling it historically accurate, not a very smart
Writing
move by
history with
Wilson.
lightning, I think was the
Ignoring
quote.
all the lynchings that were going on across the country when he was president. He ignored a lot of things.
I still can't believe Mr. Beat got away with putting that picture on YouTube.
Apparently ignoring women's rights. They were marching across the country for the right to vote. He ignored them. He ignored the first Red Scare going on, a lot of chaos around the country, didn't do anything about it. Number 6, William McKinley. This one may surprise many of you because McKinley is consistently ranked in the top half of presidents, usually because the economy was good when he was president, and the U.S. was becoming a world superpower due to a more aggressive foreign policy. Well, guess what? This foreign policy sucked. McKinley's foreign policy was based on a Christian/American exceptionalism mentality that meant the U.S. was going to be spreading its influence around the world in places it shouldn't be. The Spanish-American War, a war built on lies. McKinley, he struggled with the decision at first, but after talking to God said, yes, you should go to war with Spain, and so he went to Congress after that, and they declared war on Spain. The Philippine-American War that happened as a continuation of the Spanish-American War, that doesn't get much attention because it makes the United States look pretty bad. But McKinley justified that war, a war in which Americans killed civilians and rounded them up and put them into concentration camps. McKinley justified this because he thought the Filipinos were incapable of self-governing. He was the first to bypass Congress to send troops to fight in China during the Boxer Rebellion. As I said earlier, yes, the economy was doing well under McKinley's watch, but he had high tariffs. And again, I am not a fan of high tariffs. But mostly I'm a critic of McKinley due to his brash imperialism and his general disregard for the sovereignty of nations that just wanted to be left alone.
Again, I'll just repeat myself on the tariff thing. This is in the early 1900s, late 1800s. You can't blame someone for having high tariffs, in a time when that's the majority of the government's income. It's very different than today, and I would expect Mr. Beat, of all people, as a history teacher, to understand that. The imperialism's bad, yes, but it is very much keeping up with the times. You know, Teddy continues the imperialism when he becomes president, and I'm pretty sure Roosevelt's in his top 10. So it's just a little inconsistent. We can look back and disagree with these things, but in the content, you have to keep these things in the context of the time. And it was nothing that every other country wasn't doing. So you could understand, if not condone, McKinley kind of wanting to get in on that action, so to speak. And you know, we didn't really gain anything out of it because all that land and territory we acquired, we've pretty much given back at this point. So it was for naught. And yeah, it was, you know, very bad. You know, I'm not defending it at all. McKinley's certainly in my bottom half of presidents. I don't know exactly where I put him, but I don't know that he's bottom 10.
Number 5, Richard Nixon. He was a pathological liar who mostly just cared about himself and his own legacy, not the general welfare of the country. Boy, did that backfire. I know that...
Nixon actually says, I'm actually reading The Invisible Bridge by Rick Perlstein. It's a 4-part series that covers the 64 to 1980. Basically the Goldwater, LBJ, Nixon, Carter, Ford, Reagan, all those. And Nixon says, you know, foreign policy is my thing. Domestic policy, there are people that can handle that. He really didn't care about it. He thought foreign policy was what made good leaders. And yeah, he pretty much just always thought about how he would be remembered, and he was a very paranoid and very ego-driven man.
There are a lot of obvious reasons to hate on Nixon. He was a crook. I mean, Watergate. His paranoia and backstabbing make it seem obvious why he's on this list and most people's lists. However, the war on drugs is probably the biggest mistake of Nixon. Nixon started...
People forget about that the war on drugs doesn't start under Reagan, but it starts under Nixon, but it did.
And we are still seeing the horrible effects of it, so that's why that tops my list of problems with Nixon. Nixon got elected promising to end the Vietnam War, but the war just dragged on during his...
Interestingly enough, he runs in 68 on ending the war, and then in 72 he runs on saying that McGovern is going to make us look weak in pulling out. So he runs on ending the war, and then in 72 he runs on not ending the war, and he wins both times, and he wins even better in 72 with a historic landslide to that point. It's very interesting. You have to give him points for pulling that one off.
Presidency. Meanwhile, while secretly dropping bombs and cancer-causing chemicals on civilians in both Vietnam and Cambodia, he implemented wage and price controls, and this was horrible for the economy. A big reason why the horrible stagflation of the 70s occurred was because of his administration. Now,
yes, it does start under Nixon. I don't know that you can blame it all on him. But the price and wage controls were a response to the economic conditions, not a cause of them. I think that's an important distinction. And in making that choice, Nixon said to the time, when he was probably correct to that point, because the worry was that he would cause inflation with price and wage controls and government spending and things. And he said, no election's ever been lost over inflation, but they've been lost over recessions. So he kind of took a gamble there, and he was right. He ended up getting reelected.
Now, don't get me wrong, Nixon did a lot of good and was highly intelligent. Opening up relations with China, his policy of détente with the Soviet Union, and the creation of the EPA are probably my favorite three.
And took us off the gold standard for the last time.
But he had such poor character.
He did.
And the boogers sticking out.
I don't know that Nixon's in my bottom 10, because I think there's just so many worse candidates there, but he's bottom 15 probably.
Number 4, Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, of course, makes many lists because of the Great Depression. It's actually a myth that Herbert Hoover did nothing in response to the early stages in what would become known as the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, for example, in 1929, raising import taxes, increasing income taxes to balance the budget, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to bail out businesses, and increased crony capitalism likely just made things worse.
Crony capitalism's bad, and it's very interesting. People are broke and they're running out of money, and your answer is to raise their taxes. So he certainly did not cause the Great Depression, but he did make it worse.
Under his watch, a recession became the Great Depression. His treatment of the World War I bonus army veterans in D.C. was disgraceful. Simply put, Hoover did try to end the Great Depression, but simply made it worse. FDR didn't have much success either after that, but at least FDR seemed to be more in touch with ordinary people. Hoover seemed very out of touch with most Americans.
Which is interesting, because Hoover worked in a variety of administrations. I'm pretty sure he worked under Taft, and he was sort of the guy to get things done, and he had a lot of experience in infrastructure. He was in charge of coordinating a lot of things, and he kind of understood the systems of stuff. He understood how to get a thing from point A to point B. He understood the infrastructure and all of the moving parts of the machine of bureaucracy to get it done. So it's interesting that he was very unsuccessful as president. But that's kind of a recurring theme through history. Someone who seems incredibly qualified doing a pretty piss poor job.
Number 3, Franklin Pierce.
Hard to argue.
Oh, Pierce, where do I begin? I know. How about with the Kansas-Nebraska Act?
Horrible.
Again, a law that was one of the worst laws passed in American history.
Maybe the
He
worst.
signed it in the law. A doughface.
He doesn't mean that physically. He means that from a political standpoint.
Sorry, that was a little harsh there, but,
Actually regarded as one of our more handsome presidents.
you know, a northerner who was perfectly fine with slavery. The Ostend Manifesto. Pierce seemed to be okay with declaring war on Spain if it refused to sell Cuba to the United States. Pierce wanted Cuba annexed as a slave state. Boy, did that make northerners happy. At a rocky time when the country needed unity, Pierce arguably helped further divide the country. Also, at a time when the country needed a more hands-on and active president, he was not. But you know who was worse? Number 2.
Yep.
James Buchanan.
Now, in Pierce's defense, he was drunk most of his presidency because his son gets decapitated on the train ride to D.C. for him to take the oath of office. And you could imagine how terribly that would affect a man. Not to say that if that didn't happen that he would have been a good president, but that certainly didn't help anything. But yeah, Pierce is bottom 5, and Buchanan is 2.
Buchanan. That's right, Buchanan was worse. He took over as president after Pierce, and instead of learning from Pierce's mistakes, he just let the country become even more divided. Another case. You didn't have to bleep that out. I said okay, doughface. He was a president who did nothing. He didn't want to make anyone mad, but he also didn't want to make anyone happy. He was personally against slavery. He said it was morally wrong, and yet proceeded to speak out in favor for the Dred Scott decision.
And what he actually said in his inaugural was that whatever the result of this Supreme Court case is what we should go with. But he knew already what it was going to be. I'm pretty sure he had talked to Roger Taney or one of the Supreme Court justices, and he knew what it was going to be. So it was very easy for him to say that when he knew what the result was going to be already. And he called slavery a matter of but little importance. And when the South secedes, he says, it's not legal, but I can't do anything about it. So for 4 or 5 months when they're gearing up for the war before Fort Sumter, kind of just lets them do their thing. And his Secretary of War, and he may not have known about this, was funneling material down to the South. So very ineffective administrator.
One of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. In fact, he was so pro-South that he basically just let the South do whatever they wanted. When the states seceded after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, he blamed the Northerners and the abolitionists. By the time
Which is weird because he was from Pennsylvania.
The United States was on the brink of civil war, and the Union had fallen apart, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. And the worst president in American history, in my opinion, is Warren Harding. He once said, quote, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." I agree. He appointed many of his corrupt buddies to be in his cabinet. Some of them famously got in trouble for bribery in what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal. I know this sounds bad, but he was probably our dumbest president. He was not a deep thinker at all. He seemed to just let all of his...
I think W and Trump probably take that title, but yeah, Harding was pretty dumb and pretty bad. He's certainly not number 1. He's bottom 10, but he's like 9 or 10. He's not worst of all time.
Make all the decisions. He didn't stand for anything. You didn't know where he stood because he rarely stated where he stood on issues. He seemed to have no moral compass. While president, he would often cheat on his wife, and he had parties in the White House where they would illegally gamble and smuggle in alcohol at the height of Prohibition. He didn't.
It's important to note that a lot of prohibition, it wasn't illegal to be in possession of alcohol, but it was illegal to sell it and manufacture it. And if we're going to use cheating on your wife as a judge, well, then that's... You just saw the Mistresses video. There's a lot of other precedents that can be on that list.
Didn't ever get much work done. He preferred socializing and partying to working. When he actually did work, he signed crappy laws. One law he actually did sign was the Emergency Quota Act, which was really a law designed to favor Western and Northern European immigrants and limit immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as most of the rest of the world. To sum it up, while Harding was a nice guy who was easy to get along with, he surrounded himself with shady characters and avoided any action whatsoever while in office. He was just a horrible president. And if you haven't noticed by this point, character means a lot to me in terms of how I view a president. Though there are, of course, exceptions, like Harding, who I just mentioned, and George W. Bush. I love you, man, but you just made some really bad decisions while in office. Well, that will do it. Those are my...
So, yeah, an interesting list. You know, if I were going to rank worst presidents, I'd probably throw Andrew Jackson on that list. I would probably put John Tyler on that list. I would probably put Martin Van Buren on that list. You know, there's a lot of ineffective presidents, but actively bad ones, you know. I think there's just a few that aren't there that really should be. You know, the Trail of Tears is pretty unforgivable. I think you could make the argument for like John Adams and the Alien Enemies Act and the Sedition Acts of, 1797 or 98. Those are bad. And then there's a few on here that I just find, like Nixon's bad, yeah. And Harrison, whatever, but just interesting choices. So let me know down below who are your 10 worst presidents or who are just some of your least favorites, and please keep it civil. And then next time we do a reaction, we'll do Mr. Beat's 10 best presidents. And look at that interesting list, because there are some big exceptions or notable missing entries to that list that are going to be worth talking about, because I had the same audio issue there where it had to be re-recorded. But stay tuned for that. Let me know what you thought. Like, share, and subscribe. And remember, never stop learning.